Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I'm your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Ashley Winstead. Ashley is the USA Today best-selling author of thrillers and romances, including In My Dreams I Hold a Knife and The Boyfriend Candidate. Her work has been translated into more than a dozen languages and optioned for film and TV. She's a former academic who lives in Houston, Texas, with her husband, 3 cats, and beloved wine fridge. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, Daniela. Thank you so much for having me. I love this podcast, and I love you. So this is
I
like a
love you.
very wonderful
So
treat.
fun. So fun having you back. Ashley, who is just complaining that 4 sentences of a bio is too long. It makes her feel so uncomfortable. There's so many more things we could absolutely gush about you and your experiences and everything. So we won't gush too much because we're going to gush today about This Book Will Bury Me. Oh, Ashley!
Yeah.
Okay. Tell our listeners about This Book Will Bury Me.
Yeah, so this book will bury me. It follows a young woman named Jane Sharp, and she has recently lost her father. And in the midst of her grief and struggling with a lot of what she feels are unanswered questions about his death, she turns to the internet and the true crime community and becomes totally obsessed and falls down the rabbit hole of amateur sleuthing. And she's so attracted to this because she sees this whole group of, strangers solving questions for other people. And that's just like exactly where she wants to be. And so this book is pretty different for me in that it is the first roman à clef that I've ever written. And so for any listeners who don't know because they haven't been to English 101 in a while, and I'm also guilty, but that's a fictional work that draws loosely on real life events. So this book follows my own life. I almost joke that it's like my first little attempt at autofiction, because I drew on my own experiences after the loss of my father and my own turning to true crime and becoming really obsessed with some cases in particular. So the cases in the book that Jane and her little like private found family of sleuths encounter are loosely based on the real life cases I was obsessed with, including the University of Idaho murders, a little bit of Gabby Petito, and the Abraham Shakespeare case.
Yeah, okay. So I was like, when I was reading, because there is so much about what happened in Idaho, that at
Yeah.
first I had to be like, wait, it's not called, the town is not called that. And it was
Nope.
like, but I had to sort of be like, how, because so much of it really did feel like what we watched. And that was so recently, Ashley. I was like,
Yeah.
how are you already reflecting on this crime that seems like it just was yesterday? But let's back up because I want to talk about your dad. Um,
Yeah.
and I want to talk about Jane, whose full name is Janeway, which is
Yeah.
that's actually a character from
Yeah, Captain Janeway in Star Trek, and her dad's a huge Trekkie, so that's where her name comes from.
that. So, Janeway Sharp, and I want to talk about sort of the way you dig into that loss because obviously I know you went through that. And what was it like to relive that? Was it,
Yeah. It
yeah.
was honestly the most cathartic thing I've ever done.
Oh,
In fact, like I kind of attribute the fact that I'm now in a different place in my like grief cycle, which I know never ends, but I feel like being going through the process of writing that book. And it's so funny, it kind of connects to your question about the Idaho case about like processing things almost in real time, like so close to the events that um, it's like almost concurrent, is the same thing I was doing with my dad's passing. And not to make anyone feel uncomfortable or weird, but because this was very important to me, the way that Jane finds out about her dad's passing and so much of what happens is drawn like directly from my life, and that is my experience in a lot of ways. And you like I'm still maybe trying to unpack for myself why it was so important to like write biography, in a way, autobiography, or why I just felt this absolute compulsion to put in fiction so many real details. And I think that there was something really therapeutic about it. I think that um, fictionalizing real events gave me the necessary distance and like aesthetic distance to really process the emotion and see what was happening even in my own head from a distance that allowed me to grapple with it. So I had to kind of warn my mom and other family members before they picked this book up,
Right.
that they were just going to see a lot of real things in this book. And I think the same sort of logic applies to the cases in the book too.
So talk to us about, I mean, obviously you did find out about your dad's death was very sudden. That's the
Yeah,
thing we get about Jane's father's death.
yeah,
Very sudden. And it feels to her, of course, unnecessary, right? That there was
yeah,
some way to prevent that, which I also think you've spoken about in terms of your,
yeah,
because,
yeah,
there was there's always this idea that there's things that they could have done or we could have done, or right,
yeah,
had we been more aware, had we been more vigilant, and actually it's true to like so many versions of death, right, is
yeah,
that we can sort of, and so what Jane is processing also is her own culpability and her
yeah,
mother's culpability and her father's and his culpability, right? Which
yep,
are processing sort of and I love the question of like, because it feels so real. It's like, did he not love us enough to try harder, right? I mean,
mhm,
I have the same. My dad also, his death was, health related and seemed like there were things he could have done to take care of himself better and been around longer.
yeah,
And that is you know, and then having him there. I mean, the sort of the fact that Jane has a piece of her dad, quite
mhm,
literally, right? Some of his
yep,
ashes, by her side, and she set up this sort of shrine to him, and that mimics things she sees in those cases. Again, like all of that. Ashley, you give us this beautiful insight into how she's, her grief and where she sees other people's grief and how she can assimilate their grief. She makes her a really kind of powerful person to be doing this sleuthing, right? Because she's
yeah,
on both sides of it. She's not,
exactly.
yeah. So
She's
talk.
on both sides of it, and I really didn't want to shy away from the hard and messy parts of grief.
Yeah,
Like you said, the questions of culpability and complicity, in a way, even though that feels like such a strong word, but those are thoughts that go through your head. After my dad passed away of a heart attack, like Jane's father, it came out that his doctors had been pushing him to get on medication, high blood pressure medication that absolutely would have saved his life.
yeah,
No question.
yeah,
And he resolutely refused over like multiple times. And they're just like all these questions. Is that something that we should have known about as his family members and pushed him on? And all these things that you can't help every ugly question that kind of pours through your head. And I kind of joke that in a lot of ways, especially when someone you love's death is unexpected, it just turns you into a de facto detective. And
yes,
so this kind of like scouring through their life, trying to make sense of things, and this human need to make sense of things that either A, we ultimately never can,
right,
or just exceed us, is really at the heart of the book. And
yeah,
so I was thinking like, okay, we're gonna literalize Jane's desire to do this with her father and turn it into like this real, she's really going to become kind of an amateur detective for other people. And like you said, do the kind of like work for other people that she wishes she could do for herself and her dad. But yeah, like the messy realities of being handed a plastic bag full of ashes,
yeah,
and the like body horror of understanding that that's what remains of the person you love. Like,
Yeah.
and Jane's experience with like cremation and receiving her dad's ashes mirrors mine. Like the turn from like absolutely I cannot be in the same room with this
Right.
to oh my God, this is all I have left. I never want to be not in the same room as my dad. So just and every part of that is messy and weird, and we don't really talk a ton about those aspects of losing someone and grief. And so in every way with this book, I wanted to go into the messiest, realest, most honest places that I could.
And
Um,
which is, it's the honesty is really beautiful. And the other thing I think was so powerful about it is that you realize you only know your parent in this one little slender aspect of their life, right? They are your support. They are the person who like held you, hold you, and so much of our sort of, and this is true also, I to say of having children and the way they look at
yeah,
you, which is you have one real role for them, right? And so if you're when things are falling apart, like the way, Jane, her mother is also, of course, grieving and falling apart, and yet Jane's sort of capacity to be there for her mother is very limited, as it is because for to her it's like she's lost her person, and our parents don't we can't support them in the we're not used to supporting them in the way in which a grieving person needs to be supported, so that struggle between the two of them is also really poignant and feels very real, and I'm sure having gone through grief, you felt that too. I mean, there
oh
is like
absolutely.
everybody's seeing it differently, everybody's handling it differently, and then she gets to see these other aspects of her dad from the people that she finds um online and from the things that he's done that she discovers, which I think is also sort of amazingly beautiful, that she's hunting through the clues of who he was as well.
Yeah, she learns enough skills with her detective, her armchair detective community that she can then turn around and apply it to her father and track down people from his life and learn a lot about him, some of which is very heartening and some of which is like just cracks open
Right.
all these new questions. But yeah, with the kind of different grief, I think of those as like the small quotidian tragedies,
Yeah.
like the daily tragedies of small scale of just the ways that people who could really use each other aren't able to meet, past like ships in the night between Jane and her mom.
Yeah.
So
Right, right. And there aren't, I mean, I know you have siblings, so it's a more polarized situation when there's only two of them, right? When you don't have, I
like
also think when you don't have siblings, I mean, I have siblings, but I can imagine if you don't have siblings, it's a whole different thing to navigate without
it's a
anybody.
lot of pressure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So, okay, so let's talk about the true crime aspects because I
Yeah.
did, this reminded me in some ways of Jessica Knoll's book,
Yes.
which is I'm such a huge, huge, huge
Me
fan.
too.
That is that's like I hope you take that as the ultimate compliment because
No, I love that book, and when I was reading it, I was like, "Oh my God, we're trying to do
yes, you
similar
guys are
things."
all
Yeah,
you were sharing some brain waves.
yeah,
So tell us, like, so this is it is a very it's also like you said, it's a very different type of book for you to sort of dig so closely into something
yeah.
that is so real. So not just with the real feeling of grief which you experienced, but this so you basically when your dad passed, this was something you did. Tell us about that experience. Like, how did
Yeah.
you find yourself there?
So my dad passed in August of 2022, um, right before The Last Housewife came out.
Yes.
So that, anyway, neither here nor there, but that was just a very surreal
Yeah.
experience. And the the Idaho case, I think the news broke in November
Mhm.
of 2022, and I am a person who was aware of true crime, knew it was out there,
Yeah,
knew
yeah.
that it was something that laughed at the SNL spoofs
Right.
about women being so sucked into true crime, but I was like, not me, and when the Idaho case broke, it absolutely captured me in a way no other case had. And I became really obsessed with learning everything I could, listening to, I couldn't even tell you who these people are, what their
Right.
credentials are, but just
Right.
like internet
Right.
talking heads about theories and just the absolute tragedy of it. And I just found myself so compelled by this case. And then it started a kind of avalanche of me like looking, reading, watching documentaries, reading books about other cases, and just really kind of full scale going into a true crime era. And I remember in early 2023, like February 2023, I went to Alabama for the Hoover Public Library Southern Voices Festival.
Yeah.
So fun. And we went out to dinner afterwards, all the authors and the librarians, so fun at Bonefish Grill. And we were all talking, and one of the librarians had mentioned that she'd started like a mystery and true crime book club, and that it was incredibly popular, like more popular than anything else she'd done. And so we all started talking about what the draw of
Right.
true crime was for people, and like what people got at from it. And I remember just sitting there, like feeling like a spotlight was shining on me, like knowing that I had just recently become
Right.
that.
Right.
And sitting there at dinner, that was when like I had this one of those rare clicking moments where I had the idea that it was this like extremely human urge to know, to complete, to like know, to dispel mystery, to be absolutely uncomfortable or unwilling to have, to like let something rest without knowing it fully. And
Yeah.
I know I'm making this sound very abstract, but it was in my head that like the same thing that wouldn't let me rest in connection to my father, like wondering why did he have to die then? Could it have been prevented? Where is he now? How does this all work? Things I'm never going to get the answer to. I just couldn't, I was plagued by those questions. And that same compulsion I felt was at the heart of why I was so attracted to true crime. And that's when it like just clicked for me that this is what I needed to explore. And I had a lot of personal processing to do, both in terms of my connection to true crime and my grief around my father. And those things were married in a way that I never would have expected. So I think for me, writing about Idaho, and I'll just say like this is a book that's really interested in the communities that spring up around
Yeah.
crimes
Yeah.
more than, I mean, I'm certainly interested in Idaho as a case for reasons I'll tell you about in just a second, but the focus really is about like what we do in response to crime and all the reasons why strangers form parasocial relationships with not celebrities or musicians, but victims and victims' families. That's a weird sort of parasocial relationship
Yes.
there. And
Yes.
that's certainly like, yeah, what I would call what I was doing. So talk about like shining the bright light of interrogating for complicity on myself. But I wanted to write about Idaho because as I was watching this case unfold, it felt the like a high watermark, like we had ascended with true crime to a new level where the mania that surrounded the Gabby Petito case um, had only escalated with Idaho to a place, and here all this journalism was coming out about this and kind of think pieces. So I'm certainly not the first person to argue this, but really just influenced by this journalism, that people poured from all over the world, poured into boots on the ground, Moscow,
Yeah.
Idaho,
Yeah.
in a way that you saw a little bit with Gabby Petito, but really reached new levels with the Idaho case. And I think so many people became so passionately attached to this case, and you had parents of the families of the victims really reaching out
Yeah.
to the true crime community and saying, we need your help. Come in and like supplement what the police are doing. And so, this invitation to the true crime community, the ownership the true crime community took over this case, all of these things felt novel. And I wanted to unpack them in this book and process them. So, that is why I just felt so compelled to write about the particulars of this case. And then Abraham Shakespeare, a similar thing in the previous case that Jane and her friends
And
solved.
what do you feel like what made Idaho different? Why was I mean obviously the fact that the parents asked for help that
Yep.
escalated it for sure. But
Yep.
it almost feels like there's something about sort of the sort of ineptitude of the sort of arguable ineptitude of the police. What was it
Mhm.
that made that case, into some sort of like this, like you said, the new sort of high water mark for true crime?
I think it was the perfect storm. And I think that you're absolutely right. Even though we now know the police had the FBI, I mean we knew they had the FBI involved, but we now know that, they were actually just keeping what they were their suspicions very close to their vest, as is appropriate. Um, in being on the outside watching it like weeks go by and months and things unfold in real time, there was a real conviction among the true crime community and clearly among the victims' families and
Yeah,
the wider world that not much was happening and that the police force was really unable to identify a suspect. So there was a lot of like worry and concern there. But I will also like to talk about kind of complicity and bias. So
yeah,
something we saw come out of the Gabby Petito case was a real conversation around, missing white woman syndrome and the fact that victims who are white and pretty and women, all these things
wealthy.
factor, yes,
Yep,
healthy, have a lot of. Gabby Petito had, opened social media. There was all of these things that really that plays a role in which cases get elevated to
yeah,
that level. And here you have this case in Idaho where you have four like beautiful, you know, um, young people with these bright futures,
right, right.
sorority girls, just they're everything that fits that they're white, it's they're just everything that fits all of those biases.
Yep,
And they also had open and accessible social media. And so I think that there was you could pore over their Instagram pages. You could, there was this sense that your average Joe or Ashley, in the world could really get to know these victims in a way there was less mediation, less walls between them and you. So I think, and I'm sure there's probably 10 to 15 more reasons why this caught fire the way it did. Um, but so many of those things were questions that I wanted to talk about and explore through the mouths of armchair detectives themselves,
right,
rather than people like um, talking down
right,
to
right,
the true crime community. So yeah, all of those things I think just made Idaho take off in a way. And it's almost strange to realize that it'll be 3 years this November,
yeah,
because you're right, in so many ways it feels like yesterday.
yeah.
But I think there can be a lot of value in processing things either in real time or close to real time. At least for me.
Well, and I think it's the power of the trauma that you were experiencing, right? Was you, I mean, with the distance of it, right? It becomes it's a different thing to be able to express it and dig into it when it's so fresh has its power. It also has its challenges, and I wanted to talk about
Totally.
because you are shining a very bright light on yourself
Yeah.
and on your own, like, you're acknowledging that there was, I mean, there was some, a little bit of, I don't want to call it dysfunction, but there was a little bit of like, strange processing of grief through this
Yep.
other avenue. And so
Yep.
when you look at Jane, like, how was it to write, like in the beginning, how was it to write her? Did she develop a ton? Because I would think there's probably also a lot of that was hard to really to get to the deep part of her, or maybe it wasn't.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe you were able to dig.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that when we point lights at ourselves, it's oftentimes we are like, well, let's put some shades on.
Yeah, let's put some shades up.
Yeah.
Let's not let this, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I will say, in this particular case of writing this book, I would go so far as to say, like, I was grappling with my own complicity and exploitation of other people's tragedies to help process my own. And like that is a hard thing to talk about and put on page and like walk into a room and say, and be really open and honest about it. But um I I don't know, I feel compelled to talk about that because I know I'm not alone. And I think it's an important conversation for all of us to have. And I get people's resistance and pushback to having that conversation. But, and that's fine. But I want to talk about the ways through Jane that I participated in that.
Yeah.
And I think writing this book and doing a lot of research about true crime and why we form these attachments, and reading from the perspectives of professionals who deal with true crime community, just trying to come at it from every angle.
Yeah.
I learned a lot about the exploitative things that I participated in, and and my own complicity, and thinking about in retrospect about the things that I did and didn't do right. But to me, it remains this kind of double-edged sword because on the one hand, there is a stink of exploitation and complicity. Um, but on the other hand, I think when people are involved in true crime out of a lot of empathy, like
Yeah.
out of a sheer, and I think that's a majority of people to some degree, um, then empathy for strangers is, I think, one of the most like beneficent parts of being a human is being able to find that in yourself. So it's this constant double-edged sword for me, and that's I love writing about things that ultimately have no answers. And then you just have to like live in the tension, the uncomfortable tension.
Which I mean, I think, and actually, I want to talk a little bit about Jane's, her little posse, if you will,
Yeah.
there's a real, it is like it's sort of a joke, but it is a family. There's, five of them. There's Mistress, who's an older woman, and Lightly, who was a detective and is an older gentleman who also brings the race factor because he's very aware of the ways in which, different races get ignored in lieu of, like we talked about, sort of, wealthy, pretty, white uh,
Hmm.
young women in particular, right? And then the two other men who are sort of her brothers in all the ways. And you have this, there's this, and it's Mistress who brings it up. Um, there's different ways in which you participate, your role
Yeah.
in these, which I love, and I'm not gonna get them right. So, but it was a way of looking at sort of why somebody comes to the table to probably on lots of different things, but in particular true crime, and to try to solve it and what they're sort of, what the compulsion, where the compulsion comes from. And I loved that, Jane has this really fabulous intuition.
Yeah.
She's, she's she's a savant of sorts, when
Mhm.
it comes to, and she really does sort of parse through the different this family of hers and sort of to understand how each of them comes to the table. And that's quite powerful, like especially since like you said, they spend a lot of time together before they actually even meet. And then there's that weird scene when they all show up in Idaho and they're like,
Mhm.
here we are, like, this
Like,
is
oh my God, you're real. Oh, this is a
yes,
little too weird that you're real.
right.
You have a physical body.
Yes, and
Um,
and obviously you have habits we don't see on the screen, so there's all
yep.
that. And I loved the idea too that when Jane had lost family, she found this family because I do think that's also part of grieving is that, we are suddenly, drowning and just, reaching for anything to sort of cling on to in that loss. And that's that's true of death, it's true of divorce. Like I find that is
Mm,
there's a really interesting when we are sort of abandoned in all these different ways
yeah.
in which we will be abandoned in our lifetimes, the things we sort of reach out for and how we process them. So the whole, I mean, and then of course the mystery aspects of it and the and the fabulous twists in the story, which we obviously are not going to talk about because you have to read it.
Nope.
It's wonderful. But but I am curious, like, so what do we think? Like, obviously there's two sides, and I do think we can argue in and we see examples of it in real life where true crime um, really helps, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then there's other times when they don't. So, where do you stand on like what's changed in your perspective? Anything? How do you feel about it?
So my prediction is that we're just going to continue to see um, official law enforcement reach out and try to make a resource out of the true crime community. And part of what I'm trying to do too is kind of in this book is like assess what it is about the true crime community that can be so helpful, because in a case like the Gabby Petito case, you had this wide network of people pouring through footage and pouring through all sorts of stuff and spreading the word. And that really did bring critical evidence to the police that resulted in them being able to find Gabby. Like that was a case in which the community helped. And in a case like Idaho, you had the opposite, a lot of the opposite effects where, there were psychics, self-proclaimed psychics on TikTok, talking about how the ex-boyfriend of one of the victims, she just knew she was getting a message that he was the culprit. And then there was like wild doxing and just like fear for this young man's
Yeah,
well-being. And so you get, again, it's like this thing where it can be so helpful, but also um, you truly just have, and I mean this with no disrespect to 26-year-olds, but you have 26-year-olds,
right,
hanging out in their room listening to Taylor Swift and again, no shade here. I'm just trying to paint a picture and
right.
like, like pouring through things on their phone and lodging conjecture out into the universe that then has an effect and does shape people's thinking. So I think there's just like all of this power, and part of it is just completely linked to the new wild west of the internet that we're all
Right,
participating in.
right.
And the fact that, we're all trying to understand what the internet and like the digitalization of our lives means for everything from like the way that we think and our brain shapes to like real life crime and effects on the world. So I think we're just like in this for the wild ride. And I just see police probably trying to make use of true crime. But just to take a step back for a second, because I loved the family aspect that you pointed out, and I absolutely modeled them on a nuclear family.
Yeah,
So that was like Jane trying to reach for that family. And a shout out, I used, and this is directly in the book, but Rachel Monroe's brilliant book, Savage Appetites,
yeah,
where she writes about the different types of women in particular who are drawn to true crime
Right.
and their reasons for it. And I thought that that was so brilliant. And I also figured that Mistress, who's this retired librarian,
Yeah.
would know about this book and be
Yes.
interested in this book, and she would, be a wholesale proponent of this book. And so she almost uses it as like an Enneagram test throughout,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
asking like, oh, are you a victim, or are a detective type, or what is it that draws you? And
Right.
of course, everyone misidentifies themselves in
Which
the
I
book.
think is also right.
Yeah,
Also so fabulous because, right, of
yeah.
course we do. Of course
Of
we
course we do.
Of
Yep.
course, we misidentify ourselves. And the other thing that I really love about it is that I think it's like you said about this, it's a very, it's all, like you said, Wild West, but there is a sense of these 26-year-olds whose life, I mean, let's be honest, it's got to be really hard to be 26-year-old right now. Um,
Yeah.
and you're sort of lost in maybe just post college with no idea. The world is overwhelming, life is overwhelming, and the sense that you could do something
Yes.
just from your phone and make a difference and feel like useful and a little powerful. That is a drug as real as any other drug, right?
Oh, absolutely. And just like, I guess, to like push back about like against my 26-year-old thing, like the majority of true crime, like armchair detectives do tend to be older. So I was
Of
kind
course.
of like making a
Right.
joke. But
Right.
yeah, no, that you're retired and you have this skill set,
Yeah.
maybe, that you're really good at research, or you have the time and the patience to
Right.
pour through 10,000 hours of property records looking
Right.
for. I mean, that's incredible. Yeah, no, and the drug
Right.
of
Yeah.
feeling like you could make a difference is so powerful. And I think, that certainly was for me.
Yeah.
Like when I was really more involved, a few years ago. But yeah, just that. I've lost my train of thought. Sorry,
Well,
Danielle.
no, but I mean, I think what I said about 26-year-old applies absolutely to,
Hmm.
66-year-olds. I mean, I think it's like there is a sense that like a lot of life is like getting nowhere, treading water,
Right.
the idea that maybe you can make some small difference to something that is bigger than you, which death is usually, right? Especially
Yeah.
a violent death is bigger than us. So it's like, it makes total sense to me that people get to get addicted. And it is, I have read, of course, that it's more commonly a female pursuit. And I
Hmm.
always think that, that makes sense too, because we're sort of more often the victims of violent crime, and it's a way of sort of thinking we maybe have some control over
Right.
something that could happen to us. And if we know enough about what crimes happen, we can, I'm sure, avoid them, right?
Right, that's the
That's
thinking. Yeah.
that's
Like,
the
oh,
thing.
look at this. No, people still ask all the time, which makes sense. Why do so many women now write murder
Yeah.
books? I was at the Hamptons, and there I was on a dark thriller panel. And there was more of a kind of a confrontational question that was asked about, why we write such dark books. Don't we know that this happens in real life?
Mm.
And, isn't that why doesn't that give us pause? And I think there was like this collective response from all four of us. We were all women on this panel, who said like, yeah, that's exactly why we
Why
write
we do it?
this.
Yeah, exactly.
Because either we're processing things that have happened to us in
Right.
our life, or happened to people we love or are close friends. And I'm not talking, about my dad in that instance, but just
Of
like,
course. Right.
but or we live every day with the understanding that this is a more tangible, like, outcome that could happen, that this is like a real thing that could be waiting in the shadows for us anytime we go out, to get in our car after sundown, or
Right.
what have you. um but just to like take this in a slightly lighter direction,
Yeah, yeah.
I think one of the other attractive things about like being that 26-year-old, or that 66-year-old or whatever, and getting involved in true crime, is that it really does, even though it's digital, it becomes like a community,
Yes.
a group of friends, a
Right.
water cooler. You
Right.
know, the way that when I jump on Instagram, I'm
Right.
hanging out with my friends, you know, and so it was really fun to lurk on all sorts of forums
Yeah.
and Reddit threads and watch the patterns of conversation and watch how people spoke and watch the inside jokes and like take note of the particular language that develops. It's like any other community. It's like being a little anthropologist observing,
And
and
it's
then
just
trying.
I mean, they also like touch base, like it's somebody who's checking in with you too, right?
Yes,
I mean, it's like
absolutely.
if you're just, it's like the person who's like, why didn't you show up to work? I mean, it's a way of making sure everybody's okay. And it does feel like you're being supported in times that otherwise, especially like retirement or I mean, all the times when we feel like no one really cares. There's
This
that
is
sense of
so
like, how
big.
come you're not there? Where are you?
Yeah, where's so and so? She hasn't popped up in a while. Like absolutely. And like, "Oh, where'd you go?" "Oh, I was on vacation, couldn't post." "Okay, well, here's what you missed while you were away."
Yes.
Like
Right.
absolutely all of that. Like these are real connections,
Yeah.
real connections. Um and so I wanted to capture that too. And so like I truly had a very good time coming up with these characters
Yes.
who existed as handles.
Yeah.
And you know, it's almost like this craft challenge to try to paint a picture, a fulsome picture of a person
Which is so fun.
based.
Yeah.
Yes,
all the more minor characters,
yes,
um,
Seattle
yeah,
and like
Seattle,
yes,
exactly. I
you
mean,
know.
yeah. So that was, that was also really fun. And the other thing I just want to touch on, because I think it's really relevant too, about like to the point where people get frustrated or even a little bit angry that we write what we write. There's also,
Yeah.
I think it's a lot of testament to survival. Like whether it's emotional survival or physical survival, survival from guilt, that terrible things in one way or another happen, and the human spirit is deep and and fortified enough and resilient enough that we will move on, we will go on. And I actually think that of any lesson that I learned from reading is the lesson that I think makes the hard days easier, right? It's
Mhm.
just the idea that
No.
what we can fucking survive
Yeah.
and move through. I mean, yeah. So that's
That's so huge. Um and not to like steal that and be like, yes, this is why I wrote the book, you know, because that's, but like no, there was definitely through the process of writing the book I got to that like beautiful realization.
yeah. No, it's
um
powerful. It's so powerful. And I felt you in it. And I did, obviously I adore you. I've adored all your books, but this was so powerful actually to see you in it. And I think it just really speaks to your ability, your incredibly, first of all, your brilliance, but also your craft to be able to paint a picture of something that was so real for you and not make it feel like it was like, dramatic, like overly dramatic. I mean, there's all those things that we melodramatic that we see when things are more autobiographical. You maintain this, and Jane's sense of humor helps, right? Of course, all the sense of humor,
yes.
all of them help sort of combat the moments where we get like, oh, this is so intense, right? But I
Yep.
think kudos, like that's amazing. Um,
Thank you. I mean, well, like, first of all, this is a gift that all of us writers have in our lives, right? Is like this thing that we do, writing, is like one of the biggest gifts that for processing things.
yeah,
So that's just something we share. But to your point, a lot of autobiographical writing sometimes gets a bad rap, or they a lot of times people will tell you like advice that flies in the face of write what you know,
right.
which is like don't write actually too close to, don't self-insert. There's like so much eyebrow wagging and hair wringing around don't self-insert because you're gonna
Particularly
not.
from academia. Like that's
Oh,
your background, right?
truly.
For sure. You've got the brakes on that one.
Yeah, do not. And Well, the idea is that if a lot of times you'll be too self-indulgent,
Yes.
and you won't be able to see, the forest for the trees, because you'll insist, like, oh, I'm telling this real story about myself, so let me include all these details that I deem important. And you won't have that necessary objective distance to understand what's best for the story and what other people are going to care about, because you can't fathom people not caring about, all the details you did. So finding that balance is a struggle. I will not pat myself on the back with this book and say that I fully pulled that off, because I'm sure there's a lot of.
I remember I'll pat you on the back because I think it's beautifully done. And I agree. You showed the necessary detachment with the character of Jane to
Yeah.
make her. The other thing is we never want to see ourselves painted in a bad light. And Jane from the very beginning is like, here's where it all went to shit, which I appreciated because you're like, wait, let me
Yeah.
get the piece out. But and I think that was really following her through. Clearly she's looking back on on this experience she'd had and where it all had gone wrong, and the whole, I mean, the community, those five in particular, but also the police, the chief in Idaho, and the FBI, and there was a lot. You just brought to life a lot of incredible characters, and of course the victims as well. So it was another fabulous home run by Ashley Winstead. I'm so excited
Thank
for the world to
you.
see this.
That means so much to me. Thank you, Danielle.
You're going to be everywhere, right? You got, tell us where they can find, your schedule and go and have you
Yeah.
sign their book and all that fun stuff.
So I am most active on Instagram, so come find me and talk to me. And I love chatting on at Ashley Winstead Books over on Instagram. You can also find me at ashleywinstead.com, though I'm trying to get better at updating that website. But yeah, I will be in a few places around Texas for tour, and then I head into the Midwest. And of course, I'll see folks if they're coming to Thriller Fest, and I can't wait to see you, Danielle, there. But yeah, that's mostly where I'm going. The Midwest and
Okay, so
Texas.
Ashley Winstead Books, and actually, I'm sure,
Yep.
I know Ashley has her schedule of signing because I think
I
I've seen
do. Yep.
up there. And God, I'm jealous. I'm coming to Texas next February, I think, for the final. My book is finally going to be out. Actually, I just found out the pub day is February 24th, so I will be
Oh my
there.
God.
I know I'll be there.
I cannot wait.
I know, I'm really excited too. But Ashley's book, this book will bury me. So fabulous. Ashley, I told Ashley I stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning. I kept thinking I'd finish it in the morning, but there was no way. It's so, so good. And everybody go get your copy. You're gonna love it. Ashley, and if you don't know Ashley already, she's on all sides of the fence. You can read romance with her, you can read dark thrillers with her. So incredibly talented. Ashley, thank you
Thank
so much for
you,
joining
Danielle.
me.
Thank you. This is such an honor. Thank you for having me.
Everybody, this is Killer Women with Ashley Winstead, and we will see you next time. Bye.